We're in November and it's Islamophobia Awareness Month again. And I think there's a lot of talk in this month around hate crime, around celebrating Muslims and trying to make them more acceptable. But what we don't talk about is the root cause of anti-Muslim hatred or Islamophobia, which is the institutionalized and systemic aspect of it. Today, I want to talk about something that's often confused. So we have Islamophobia, for want of a better term, versus the racialization of Muslims. We hear both terms a lot, especially in academia and public debate. But here's a question that really bothers me. Why are Muslims being racialized when we're a faith community and not a race? Islamophobia at its core is a religious hatred. It's centuries old, long before the ideas of race even existed. If you think about the Crusades, the Spanish Inquisition, the colonial suspicion of Muslim resistance, these weren't about skin colour. They were about faith, belief, and power. Before the 1800s, there was no concept of race as we know it. But Muslims, a multicultural, multi-ethnic and deeply diverse group, were already being persecuted for refusing to conform to Christian norms. So originally this was religious persecution. But then modern Western thought created something called racialisation, the idea that people can be treated like a race even when they're not. It's a modern academic term that tries to explain how societies turn difference into danger. Racialization is about being treated as a threat based on how you look, not what you believe. But with Muslims, there's no single Muslim look. You can be black, white, Arab, South Asian, Chinese, or even blonde-haired and blue-eyed. So the term starts to break down. So why do academics and institutions still talk about the racialization of Muslims? Because it helps Western societies to make sense of their own behaviour. It's on their terms, because racialization is a Western concept to describe Western dynamics. It shows how white majority societies construct groups like Muslims as others. These terms, even racial ones, don't reflect how Muslims and people of colour see themselves, and it doesn't help understand who we are. In Islamic thought, identity isn't racial, it's ethical, spiritual and communal. Oppression isn't explained through race but through injustice and tyranny. So when we accept Western colonial terms like racialization, we risk flattening our own history, centuries shaped by slavery, by empire, war and resistance, into a category that doesn't quite fit. And we are allowing the colonized to still control us. Let's be clear, Islamophobia or anti-Muslim hatred is rooted in religious hatred, colonial violence and political control. In modern Western context, they say that Muslims are racialized. We're treated as if our identity is visible, fixed, even dangerous, and we are pigeonholed and stereotyped. But Muslims don't all fit the same mould, and it doesn't mean Islamophobia is racism. This also doesn't explain institutional and systemic racism. So the people affected by Islamophobia, Muslims, don't identify through race. And when the source of the hatred is religious, putting it in racial terms doesn't solve the problem. Because the truth is simpler. Muslims are targeted not because of race, but because of faith and because of centuries-old fears, myths and distortions about Islam itself. Let us describe our identity and our oppression on our own terms. So why do institutions prefer the language of racialization? Because Western liberal societies have separated faith from the state, religion has been pushed into the private domain, and it makes people uncomfortable at an institutional level and sometimes wider. So it's much easier for an institution to talk about racism, which is now widely condemned. It's easier than talking about religious hatred, which is often dismissed or misunderstood as criticism of ideology. By calling Islamophobia a form of racialisation, they can fit it neatly into existing legal frameworks, anti-discrimination law, critical race theory, and public diversity programs, which are all built around race. But this comes at a cost. It erases the religious nature of the oppression. It means Islamophobia gets deprioritized and ignored. It means it's not understood at all. You can see it in practice. Public institutions struggle to call out Islamophobia directly, even when it's clear, because they say we don't do faith. And in my own experience, this gap is obvious because diversity and inclusion frameworks are set to handle race, not faith. And yes, the Equality Act 2010 protects religion, but in reality, religious discrimination often gets reframed as cultural misunderstanding or unconscious bias, and not something serious or worth spending too much time on. Faith identity, especially Muslim identity, is treated as awkward, too political, too different. So Muslims end up translating our experiences into racial terms just to be heard. But if someone mocks our Muslim name or calls somebody a hijabi terrorist or throws a pig's head at a mosque, how is that racism? The real issue, Islamophobia, disappears in translation when you call it racism. The frameworks to deal with faith-based hate under racism is limited. They don't know what to do with faith-based hate properly under this category. It gets deprioritized or mislabeled in this context. And so Muslims fall through the cracks. So why does race take precedence over faith? Because Western societies are built around race-based systems, colonial hierarchies that decided who was human, who was civilized, and who belonged. And because race is visible while faith is assumed to be private. So when a woman wears hijab or a man has a Muslim name, society doesn't see faith, it sees race. This turns a spiritual choice into a public marker to be policed. Faith becomes flattened into appearance when it isn't. So no, Islamophobia isn't about my race, and it's time we reclaim the language that's used to describe us, because we don't need to accept Western academic labels to explain the oppression that we've lived through for centuries. The Quran clearly says, "O humanity, we created you from a male and a female and made you into peoples and tribes so that you may know one another. And the most noble of you in the sight of Allah is the most righteous among you." Our diversity is divine. Our faith is not a race. And our oppression should never be redefined to make it easier for others to talk about. We need to tell our own stories in our own words.